Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you joining us tonight via the internet. Tonight marks the beginning of the holiest celebration of the entire liturgical year, the Paschal Triduum, during which we commemorate the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ for our redemption. We begin the Triduum this evening with the Mass of the Lord's Supper. At this Mass, we remember that final meal that Jesus had with his apostles, at which he washed their feet and gave them the gifts of the Eucharist and the priesthood. As I reflect upon the meaning of Holy Thursday this year, in the midst of all that we are going through, my thoughts keep returning to a great Catholic man of the 20th century by the name of Dominic Tang. Dominic Tang was a Jesuit priest from China. In 1951, he was made a bishop, and just a few years later, the communist authorities in China created the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, which took control of the church in China away from the Pope and placed it in the hands of the Chinese government. All Catholic priests and bishops in China had to swear allegiance to the association rather than to the Pope and the Vatican, or they risked being imprisoned. When Bishop Tang was asked whom he swore allegiance to, he proudly declared that his first loyalty was to the Vicar of Christ on earth, the Pope. And for that decision, he would pay a heavy price. Tang was arrested, given no trial, and placed in solitary confinement, where he remained for the next 22 years. His only crime? Being a Catholic bishop loyal to the Pope. Tang wrote about his time in prison in his memoirs entitled "How Inscrutable His Ways." One incident from his recollection stands out in a particular way tonight. Tang recounts that after 5 years in solitary confinement, his jailers came to the door one day and told him that he could leave his cell for a few hours and do anything he wanted with his free time. He could go for a walk in the sunlight. He could take a hot shower. He could call or write to his family. He could do just about anything he wanted within the confines of the prison walls. What did the good bishop choose to do with those precious few moments of freedom? "I would like to celebrate Mass," he said. After 5 years in a damp, windowless cell, with no comforts or privileges whatsoever, the one thing Bishop Tang wanted to do more than anything else was to say Mass and receive the Eucharist. He was granted permission and proceeded to celebrate the most moving Mass of his entire life. In 1981, he was released from prison and sent into exile not too far from here in Stamford, Connecticut, where he lived until his death in 1995 at the age of 87. He celebrated Mass every day for the rest of his life and never once took for granted the great gift of the Eucharist that had been so cruelly taken away from him during his time in prison. Now, I think you can probably figure out why Bishop Tang's story comes to my mind on a day like today. Most of us are imprisoned under house arrest right now. Many people are in solitary confinement right now. And for the last month, all of you who are not priests have been deprived of the Mass and the Eucharist. Right now, we are all getting a very small taste of what Bishop Tang experienced for 22 years of his life. To be isolated and to be without Mass is really hard, whether it lasts for 2 decades or just for 2 months. This Lent, fasting has taken on a whole new meaning for us. We not only fasted from earthly foods like meat and desserts this Lent, but for the first time in any of our lives, we had no choice but to fast from heavenly food too. This coming Sunday will be the 5th Sunday in a row that we have been away from Mass and without the Eucharist. And like Jesus at the end of his 40 days in the desert, we're starving. All over the world, Catholics are crying out, "We want to go back to Mass. We want to receive the Eucharist again." Spiritually, we feel like we are under a cloud. Well, as the old saying goes, every cloud has a silver lining, and that includes this one, the one that we're under right now. This evening, I would like to encourage everyone listening to focus on that silver lining rather than on the cloud itself. And I am convinced that the silver lining of this cloud is a special grace that God is offering us, if only our hearts are open to receive it. What could that grace possibly be? Well, let me explain it this way. Sometimes God has to take something away from you before you can fully appreciate what you have. When you possess a treasure for long enough, even if it's very precious, it's easy to start taking that treasure for granted. Sometimes you have to lose it in order to be reminded of just how valuable it is. We Catholics possessed the greatest treasure of all. Jesus gave us that treasure on the evening of the first Holy Thursday, and that treasure is the Eucharist. The Eucharist. Not mere bread, but really and truly Jesus' body, blood, soul, and divinity, made such by the miracle that happens at every single Mass. This treasure is reserved in our tabernacles, it's adored in our monstrances, and it's received on our tongues. Regardless of how much money you have or how many toys you own, if you're a Catholic, then the Eucharist is the single greatest treasure that you possess. St. Maximilian Kolbe once said that if the angels could be jealous of human beings for something, they would be jealous of us for one thing. We get to receive the Eucharist, and they don't. We will only fully understand in heaven how fortunate we were on earth to have had the Eucharist, and just how many graces we received during our lives through the Eucharist. Do we truly appreciate the gift we have been given? Do we truly appreciate the Eucharist for the treasure that it is? For sure, many people do. Right here in our own parish, for example, I have been so inspired by the enthusiasm I witnessed this Lent for Eucharistic adoration. The number of people who committed to spend a weekly hour with Jesus in the Eucharist was astronomical. From the first day we had adoration, our church was packed with adorers. And even once the pandemic hit, so many people continued to come that not once did we have to cancel a single hour of adoration. That is a beautiful testament from our own parish family to the love that so many Catholics hold in their hearts for the Blessed Sacrament, no matter what studies may say to the contrary. But at the same time, we have to be real and acknowledge that there are many Catholics still in our world who do not yet fully appreciate the treasure they possess. When only 1/3 of American Catholics say that they believe Jesus is really present in the Eucharist, you can be sure that not everyone fully appreciates this treasure. When only 17% of American Catholics go to Mass every Sunday, you can be sure that not everyone fully appreciates this treasure. When churches with tabernacles inside remain empty all day long with rarely a visitor, you can be sure that not everyone fully appreciates the treasure. And what does God do when his treasures are not fully appreciated? He takes them away. Not as punishment, but in order to reignite within his people a love for something that they have begun to take for granted. Right now, the greatest of all the treasures we have has been taken away from us. But it is precisely through this painful privation that God is trying to lead all of us to a greater love for that treasure than we ever had before. For some people, this may even be the beginning of a brand new relationship with Jesus in the Eucharist. For others, it may lead to a total rediscovery of Jesus in the Eucharist. Yes, the clouds over our head may be dark, but what a silver lining they will end up having if only we open our hearts to the grace God is offering us. Someday, hopefully very soon, we'll all be back here worshiping God together. We won't be watching Mass from behind a screen because we'll be here with our bodies. We won't be making spiritual communions because we'll be receiving the Eucharist sacramentally on our tongues. What a glorious day that will be. It will perhaps be the happiest day of this year. When that day finally comes, we will no doubt experience the same joy that the apostles felt at the Last Supper when they received the first Eucharist, and the same joy that Bishop Dominic Tang experienced that day in jail when he said his first Mass in 5 years. As we eagerly wait for that day to come, let us open our hearts to God's grace, and let us allow that grace to increase our hunger for, our devotion to, and our love of the greatest treasure we possess, the treasure given to us almost 2,000 years ago on this very night, the most holy Eucharist. Amen.